Biafra Britain's Shame. Chapter 4. An African Affair. According to Senator Eugene McCarthy, the US has exerted pressure on a number of African nations not to recognize Biafra. The British Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, admitted with surprising frankness in the House of Commons on January 30, 1968, that his government had done everything in our power to end the fighting in Nigeria, including trying to discourage other countries from getting involved in supporting secession in that country. British pressure was exerted on African Commonwealth countries, in particular in East and Central Africa, where Presidents Nyerere of Tanzania, Obote of Uganda, Kenyatta of Kenya, and Kaunda of Zambia had repeatedly pleaded with both sides in Nigeria to refrain from bloodshed. President Nyerere's appeal to accept African mediation was regarded by Chief Enahoro, Nigeria's Commissioner for Information, as an interference in Nigeria's internal affairs. A Nigerian envoy was sent to East Africa in June 1967 to point out that any offer of mediation must recognize that federal authority extended over the whole of Nigeria, which was patently not the case, and that there must be no attempt to deal with Ojukwu directly. The four presidents were due to meet in Nairobi on July 8 to find some means of persuading Nigeria to refrain from using force. But the war started on July 6, and the African leaders could do nothing but appeal for a halt to the fighting. On April 13, 1968, Tanzania recognized Biafra. It was the first country to do so, and President Nyerere, explaining this action, said that the unity of a country can only be based on the general consent of the people involved. He said that mass support for the establishment and defense of Biafra was obvious. We are convinced that unity cannot be maintained by force. Official circles in Dar es Salaam have suggested that recognition of Biafra was somewhat easier in their case because they had at that time no diplomatic links with London. Relations with Britain had been broken over Rhodesia. The British had therefore no means of bringing pressure to bear on President Nyerere. President Obote was expected to follow Nyerere's action, and his failure to do so was said to be at least in part the result of persuasion from London. In the case of Zambia, Britain apparently suggested that support for the Nigerian rebellion might make it difficult for the British government to cooperate with the Zambian government against the rebellious Rhodesian regime of Ian Smith. Nevertheless, President Kaunda, who is a difficult man to shake in his convictions about what he considers to be morally right or wrong, recognized Biafra on May 20, 1968. The official statement declared that the Zambian government was convinced that the heritage of bitterness stemming from this horrifying war would make it impossible to create any basis for the political unity of Biafra and Nigeria. Gabon, accusing Nigeria of genocide, recognized Biafra on May 8, 1968. The Ivory Coast followed on May 14th. Lagos, infuriated, accused these two francophone states of being French puppets. Even in London and Washington, where a more dispassionate mood should have prevailed, it was suggested that Gabon and the Ivory Coast had acted under pressure from Paris. But why this should have been so was not explained. Gabon and Ivory Coast are, in fact, among the most prosperous African states. There are several ex-colonies of France which are poor and largely dependent on French aid, and therefore presumably responsive to the political wishes of Paris. Had it been General de Gaulle's desire to generate African support for Biafra, he could have most easily acted through these countries. Yet Chad, Upper Volta, and Niger, to name some of them, have remained firm supporters of Lagos. In fact, it was the other way round. It was President Houphouët Boigny of the Ivory Coast who persuaded General de Gaulle and his government to come out in July 1968 with his declaration that the Nigerian conflict should be resolved on the basis of self-determination. The blood and the suffering borne for more than a year by the population of Biafra show their will to assert themselves as a people. Observers, mainly in Britain, have suggested a variety of motives for the gallows support of the Biafran cause. They said that he was driven by his Anglophobia to undermine British influence in West Africa, that he wanted to destroy Nigeria because it was so much larger and richer than the ex-colonies of France, that his support for Biafra was in line with his support for separation in Quebec, that he hoped to gain control of Biafra's mineral wealth for France. This last point is perhaps the least likely. When the statement was made, the bulk of the oil areas were already in Nigerian hands, but there may be a grain of truth in some of the other suggestions. Nevertheless, it was Alfred Boigny who brought the case of Biafra to his attention and who persuaded him that it deserved the support of France. Since Britain, the US, and U-turns insist that the war is an African affair, it ought to be of interest to quote what a respected and experienced African leader like Alfred Boigny has to say on the problem. All of us in the OAU recognize the overriding importance of unity. Unity as the ideal framework for the development of Africa, but the African cannot permit it to become his grave. Unity is for the living, not for the dead. The culpable indifference of Africa to this war does not excuse that of the rest of the world. Since my country's accession to independence, we in the Ivory Coast have shown the greatest possible consideration and understanding for the British. Personally, I have never hidden my admiration for the great effort at decolonization undertaken by Britain. I even understood and admitted the complexity of the problem posed by the unilateral declaration of independence by the whites in southern Rhodesia. I have opposed the use of force in Rhodesia because I oppose all forms of violence and because I knew that the British would never go to war against their white brothers there. I cannot condemn fratricidal conflict in Nigeria and approve of it in Rhodesia. Therefore, I hardly understand and find it difficult to accept the attitude of the British government towards the people of Biafra. That the Russians, faithful to their policies, should supply arms to the Nigerian government, we can understand. That the British government, leader of the Commonwealth, whose duty should have been to play the role of mediator, should furnish the most lethal weapons for the massacre of Biafrans, who are themselves citizens of the Commonwealth, surpasses comprehension. All of us deplore the war that the unfortunate Vietnamese people have had to bear for 30 years. The Vietnamese War cannot, however, compare in horror with the war in Biafra. More people die in Biafra from hunger than in Vietnam. A ceasefire and negotiations can bring peace to Biafra. There is no particular political or ideological trend determining the African support which either side commands. Algiers, on the extreme left of Africa's political spectrum, and Malawi, on the extreme right, are both ardent supporters of the Nigerian cause. President Nyerere, the socialist, and President Alfred Boigny, the conservative, despite their divergent political views, are in full agreement about Biafra. The only bias in African attitude is religious. This may not be a religious war, but the Gowon government in Lagos came into power through the Muslim North, which has dominated the Nigerian political scene since long before independence. Nigeria therefore receives the automatic support of Islam. President Nasser in Cairo has supported the Nigerian Air Force with Egyptian pilots, and countries with predominantly Muslim populations such as Guinea, Mali, the Sudan, and Chad are solidly on the side of Lagos. President Senya of Senegal, for example, who has accused Nigeria of genocide and who called earlier on in the war for the withdrawal of Nigerian troops from Biafran soil, maintaining that Biafra had an organic right to secede, has not recognized Biafra. He depends too much on the Muslim section of his population. The only exception in this religious lineup is President Bourguiba of Tunisia, who protested on one occasion that under the pretext of unity, everything was being done to destroy an ethnic group of 10 million Igbos. One cannot stand idly by before such a massacre. M. Diallo Telly, the Secretary General of the OAU, is a Muslim, and Tanzanian sources say that his religious prejudices have played a major role in paralyzing any attempt by the organization to find a solution to the conflict. It is easy to believe allegations that he has been conducting a private vendetta against Biafra without paying attention to the causes of the Nigerian dispute. He arrived in Lagos a week after the beginning of the war to declare that all African heads of state are unanimous in their view that the present Nigerian crisis is a domestic affair. Although African heads of states generally disagree on many political issues, yet there is no single agreement on the Nigerian crisis. This was patently untrue. The OAU held its September 1967 summit meeting in Kinshasa. Nigeria was not on the agenda because of the refusal by Lagos of outside mediation in what the federal leaders considered to be an internal affair. There was, however, a good deal of behind-the-scenes talk about the war, and the summit appointed a peace committee, but assigned to it on Nigerians' insistence a consultative rather than a mediatory function. The final resolution deplored secession in general and reaffirmed support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Nigeria, pledging the OAU's faith in the federal government. The consultative committee consisted of 6 heads of state: President Ankara of Ghana, Ahidjo of Cameroon, Diori of Niger, Tubman of Liberia, Mobutu of Congo, Kinshasa, under the chairmanship of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. It finally met in Lagos at the end of November 1967. Secretary General Diallo Telly was there, but Presidents Tubman and Mobutu were unable to come. They did not miss much. The whole thing was over in a matter of hours. A communique issued by the committee at the end of its first meeting with Nigerian leaders called on Biafra to renounce secession and accept Nigeria's 12-state structure. It mandated General Ankara to inform the Biafran leaders of this conclusion and to get their reaction. Then the committee dispersed. President Diori of Niger said on his return from Nigeria that the committee had gone to Lagos to assure the Nigerian government that the OAU sympathized with it. Diallo Telly said that the main result of the meeting had been the full understanding and agreement reached by the OAU and the federal government of Nigeria as to the ways and means which would safeguard the country's unity, territorial integrity, and peace of Nigeria. Not surprisingly, the Biafrans were outraged. The committee had pronounced judgment without hearing their side of the case. President Ahidjo has since disclosed that the members of the committee had been promised that the deliberations would include General Ojukwu, but when they arrived in Lagos, this was refused by the Nigerian authorities. In fact, the Nigerian newspapers at the time reported that the federal military government had made it clear that Ojukwu was not acceptable at the conference table to discuss the end of the current hostilities. It had asked the Igbos to throw him out and choose a new leader. This was the end of the OAU peace effort for the time being. In April 1968, a few days after President Nyerere's recognition of Biafra, Nigeria declared herself ready for the unconditional negotiations. These eventually took place in Kampala in May with the assistance of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and they broke down because Nigeria would not even discuss a ceasefire outside the context of a united Nigeria on terms which amounted to a Biafran surrender. In July 1968, a year after the outbreak of the war, the OAU Consultative Committee on Nigeria convened in Niamey, the capital of Niger. This time, the committee decided to invite General Ojukwu without giving Nigeria a chance to veto the move. Nor apparently was Lagos consulted in the decision that Emperor Haile Selassie was to preside over another peace conference in Addis Ababa in August. When the chairmanship for the Kampala conference had been discussed 2 months earlier, the Nigerians had said it was a matter of principle for them not to involve heads of state, since the matter was an internal one. There was, therefore, a slight shift of the OAU committee in favor of Biafra. This new spirit was not unconnected with the fact that President Hamani Diori, in whose capital the meeting took place, had consulted his influential friend and neighbor, President Houphouët Boigny, concerning the matter. For a brief moment, there was some hope that the committee might reconcile the Biafran and Nigerian positions. But the improved atmosphere was not translated to Addis Ababa, where the full-scale peace conference opened on August 5th, perhaps because the Ethiopian capital is the seat of the far from impartial OAU Secretariat, which serviced the talks. Ojukwu was present at the opening, but Gowon, despite repeated invitations and appeals from the emperor, refused to attend. Lagos also failed to respond to the emperor's ceasefire call, and Nigeria's chief delegate said in his opening statement that the central issue was whether or not the parts of the East Central state of Nigeria, still under the control of the other side, can be reintegrated into Nigeria through these talks. The first 3 points he listed for discussion during the conference were: form and manner of renunciation of secession, disarming of rebel troops, policing of rebel areas. The demand for surrender could hardly have been put more bluntly than that. The Addis Ababa conference dragged on for a month and was adjourned by the emperor on September 9th to Algeria, where the annual OAU summit meeting was about to take place. But the Algerians refused the Biafran delegation visas, and the Biafrans were therefore not represented at the meeting. Nigeria was on the agenda, this time in the form of a report by the emperor as chairman of the consultative committee to the summit. It did not seem very likely that these would produce any OAU endorsement of Biafra's claim to sovereign status, but it was widely expected that the summit would recommend a ceasefire to be followed by negotiations. Emperor Haile Selassie had already set a precedent in August by calling for a halt to the fighting, and there seemed a general consensus among African leaders that the first priority was to end the bloodshed. A ceasefire also seemed essential if sufficient relief was to be got into Biafra. The international outcry at the starvation in Biafra and at the indiscriminate bombing of Biafran territory had made many African leaders conscious that the reputation of their continent was at stake. It was therefore surprising that the leaders in Algiers voted with an overwhelming majority for a resolution calling on the Biafrans to cooperate with the federal authorities with a view to restoring the peace and unity of Nigeria. Peace at the price of surrender once again. In retrospect, it seems clear that the Algiers vote was influenced by the military situation. Delegates were told that the defeat of Biafra was only a matter of days and that a ceasefire call would come too late. In fact, the Nigerians had made determined efforts to bring Biafra to the verge of defeat whenever international pressure forced them to consider a political rather than a military solution. The Kampala conference was preceded by the fall of Port Harcourt, which resulted in the Nigerian claim at the talks that in military terms the concept of Biafra is now dead. In September 1968, at the time of the Algiers summit, Aba and Owerri, two of Biafra's most important towns, fell to Nigerian troops. In April 1969, during the third meeting of the Consultative Committee, which took place in Monrovia, the Nigerians were on the verge of capturing Umuahia, which had served the Biafrans as a temporary capital for some months. But the Monrovia meeting was interesting because it exposed the role played by Diallo Telly in the OAU's so-called search for peace. After the opening session, during which the Biafrans suggested a 2-week truce to allow for political talks, while the Nigerians merely repeated their original demands, the committee divided for separate discussion with the two sides. President Tubman and Diori were to deal with the Biafrans, while Emperor Haile Selassie and President Mobutu were to consult with the Nigerians. Of the two remaining committee members, President Ahidjo apparently kept aloof, while Ghana was represented by the Vice Chairman of the National Liberation Council, Mr. Hale, because of the recent leadership crisis in Accra. Diori apparently took the leading part of the discussions with the Biafrans. He accepted their argument that they would have to retain control of their internal and external security to provide the necessary safeguards for their people. He also accepted the argument that in view of the bitterness of the war, political union with Nigeria was not immediately possible. Nevertheless, he returned to the question of a united Nigeria, urging the need for territorial integrity. But this was not the main obstacle. The Biafrans would have settled at that stage for any loose association meeting their basic demands. Various possibilities were discussed, and it appeared that some formula might be found. Diori then asked Telly to draft a communique on these lines, but when the document was brought, he noticed that it did not mention the provision of the Biafrans' control of their security, which he had asked to be included. He returned the draft to Telly with the request that the omission be corrected, but Telly came back a few minutes later to inform Diori and Tubman that Ahidjo wished to consult them in a different part of the building. When the president returned about half an hour later, they brought with them a draft which referred to negotiations in the context of a united Nigeria. The Biafrans protested, and it was finally agreed that they were to submit suggestions for an alternative wording the following day. But that night at a dinner given by President Tubman, the Biafrans learned that the communique with reference to the Nigerian unity had already been agreed to. In response to their plea that this was not in accordance with what had been arranged, President Tubman and Diori met the Biafran delegation again later that evening. The Biafrans said that they could not commit themselves to unity without knowing what this entailed, but that they were prepared to discuss all possibilities which might lead to peace, not excluding Nigerian unity. Diori asked whether they were prepared to state this explicitly in the communique, and when they agreed, he asked them to word an acceptable amendment. But while they retired to the other end of the room to complete the amended draft, Telly again argued with Tubman and Diori. A few minutes later, Tubman called them to say that it was now too late to amend the draft because the wording had already been agreed to earlier on in the day. Diori left early the following morning, several hours before the communique was issued. It urged both sides to accept, in the supreme interest of Africa, a united Nigeria, which ensures all forms of security and guarantee of equality of rights and privileges to all its citizens. Within this context, both sides were asked to agree to an immediate end to the fighting and the opening without delay of peace negotiations. The statement then noted with satisfaction that Nigeria had accepted these proposals and with regret that Biafra had not. Diallo Telly added for both measure that for the first time we can fix the responsibility where it belongs. We regret that Biafra has rejected the proposals. What the Monrovia meeting showed clearly, though not for the first time, was the despicable role played by the OAU Secretary General in the African peace initiatives. President Diori's conciliatory part on this occasion was due to the influence of Hubert Burgney, who had issued a statement before the meeting deploring that Biafra had no friend on the consultative committee. He had not joined the committee when it was formed in Kinshasa in 1967 because he believed that the Ivory Coast was adequately represented by my friend Diori, who was chairman of OCAN, the grouping of French-speaking African states. Diori seems to have taken this broad hint to heart, and the Biafrans say that he was the most constructive African leader at Monrovia, despite his past history of support for Lagos. If Houphouët-Boigny was able to induce a more constructive attitude to peacemaking in President Diori, the same could have been achieved by British and American influence on the leaders of the Congo, Kinshasa, Ghana, Liberia, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. Countries which rely on a very large extent on the assistance from the Western powers. In fact, despite the continuous contact with the OAU, which officials of the State Department in Washington and of the Foreign Office in London tell the critics of their policy they maintain, pressure has obviously not been brought to bear in any direction which might conflict with the wishes of Lagos or the military demands of a policy which is designed to force Biafra back into a united Nigeria. Instead, it is constantly pointed out by the British and US governments that only 4 out of 40 African countries supported Biafra at the Algerian summit. This is misleading. In fact, the OAU ministerial meeting in Addis Ababa in February 1969, at which the foreign ministers of all African states were expected, appealed to both sides in the Nigerian civil war to implement an immediate ceasefire and then negotiate. A ceasefire followed by negotiation is and was Biafra's formula for ending the conflict, and the Biafrans said they would comply. It was the Nigerians who refused. Despite the Algerian vote, many African leaders have since this summit spoken in support of an immediate ceasefire to be followed by negotiations. They include President Obote of Uganda, who told the 5th meeting of East and Central African leaders in Lusaka during April 1969 that the British Prime Minister's visit to Lagos the previous month had done harm by concentrating on getting relief supplies into Biafra instead of concentrating on the main issue, which is to end the war and stop Africans killing Africans. He also complained that the Nigerians were putting pressure on all African countries not to recognize Biafra, adding that a decision like this cannot be taken in Lagos. If Uganda were to recognize Biafra, that decision would have to be taken on the soil of Uganda. The war is no longer an internal affair because 3 superpowers are already involved in the conflict. Prime Minister Siaka Stevens of Sierra Leone has also called for a ceasefire, suggesting at the time of the Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference in London in January 1969 that a Commonwealth Mediation Committee be formed to reconcile the two sides. This proposal was angrily turned down by the Nigerians, and Mr. Stevens has since told President Nixon that he regretted that the Commonwealth Conference had not taken up his suggestion, but had followed an ostrich policy instead. President Nyerere pointed out after the Monrovia meeting that as long as Britain and the Soviet Union supplied Nigeria with arms, Africa was unable to act. Czechoslovakia, which has supplied Nigeria with jet aircraft at the beginning of the war, decided in 1968 not to send any further military supplies to Lagos. The Netherlands, France, and Belgium have also banned arms sales, and on May 15, 1969, the Assembly of the Council of Europe appealed to all governments to establish jointly a general arms agreement covering a ceasefire in Nigeria. The Italians proposed a joint Western European Union attempt to obtain a ceasefire and an arms embargo when the WEU met in Luxembourg in February 1969. During the debate, the French and British representatives clashed. M. Lipskovsky of France dismissed as irrelevant the British argument that WEU members recognized under the Lagos government. Biafra had become a reality which federal troops had been unable to reduce, he said, thus giving rise to speculations that France was planning to accord Biafra full recognition. Reporting this, the BBC made the revealing remark that such an act would be regarded as an anti-British move, thus reinforcing the impression that in the war with Biafra, Mr. Harold Wilson was the principal and Gowon merely his second. This appeal, like others of a similar nature, was resented and rejected by Lagos. Britain then brought pressure to bear on the Swedish government, and the unofficial Swedish support which got Biafra an air force in May 1969 certainly did not meet with approval from the authorities in Stockholm. Nevertheless, Count Carl von Rosen and the 5 Swedish aircraft he brought with him to Biafra have made him a hero throughout Scandinavia. In April 1969, the foreign ministers of the 5 Scandinavian countries announced that they were not prepared to endanger food deliveries to Biafra by bringing up the Nigerian-Biafran War up in the United Nations. The only conclusion to be drawn from this apparent non sequitur is that the Scandinavians were persuaded to abandon their attempts to get international action because of the threat that these would provoke Nigeria into stopping the relief flights, a curious argument, considering that they had already interfered to the limit of their ability with the airlift. U-Tant, strangely enough, in view of the available evidence, has also asserted that the Nigerians have not been interfering with the Biafran relief operations. He has consistently repulsed appeals for actions to stop the war, arguing that the UN must be guided in this matter by the OAU, which had decided that it was Nigeria's internal affair. By a similar token, Hitler's policy towards the Jews was a domestic German issue. Towards the end of 1968, the Canadian Foreign Minister, Mr. Mitchell Sharp, wrote to U-Tant to inform him that Canadian public opinion, and that of many other countries besides, could not understand how the United Nations could fail to concern itself with the prevention of starvation in Nigeria. The reply from the UN Secretary General was that sufficient support for such action was lacking. US Under-Secretary Katzenberg maintained that the African countries themselves opposed taking the matter before the UN, and without their backing, it would be impossible to muster sufficient support. For the UN to take up an issue of this gravity and then fail would, aside from leading to a loss of prestige for the organization, only aggravates the situation in Africa itself. In view of the considerable African and non-African support for an immediate ceasefire, it is doubtful whether U-Tant really went deeply into the wishes of member states on this question. The only sign so far that he is aware of the existence of Biafra came in June 1969, when he appealed to Biafra not to execute 18 Italian, West German and Lebanese oil technicians whom the Biafrans captured west of the Niger and condemned for collaborating with the Nigerian war efforts. This is more than he did for the million Biafrans who had died. The paralysis of the UN in the case of Biafra was largely based on the assumption that the Security Council would be blocked on the issue by the USSR. Whether this would actually be the case cannot be decided without the attempts being made, and as several million lives may be at stake, the attempt must surely be worth making. When the British Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, Mr. Michael Stewart, suggested during the March 1969 parliamentary debate on Nigeria that the Russians would not agree to an arms embargo, the Soviet embassy in London was surprised about the certainty with which their attitude had been defined. A member of the parliament, Mr. Michael Barnes, who had made inquiries at the USSR embassy concerning this matter, was informed that no formal British approach on a possible embargo had then been made. It is possible that Britain and not the Soviet Union has been the principal obstacle to effective international action. Britain, aided and abetted by America, is the chief culprit. But it will be too easy to leave it at that. The Scandinavian countries which were going to act but have not acted, the rest of those who were horrified but not horrified enough to take positive steps, not to forget the African leaders who have stood by, repeating over and over again their formula about Nigerian unity. Abracadabra, confounding the substance and the word, they are all to blame. When history adds up the sins of omission and commission committed in the name of such concepts as unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, legalistic monstrosities when applied to Nigeria, then this war will come to epitomize the inhumanity of our age. One day the world will look into the eyes of Biafra and recoil at the reflection of its own image.